I'm Mackenzie. This is Trevor, Miriam, and Owen, and today we're going to be talking about GMOs. Ever since their first attempted introduction in 1972, genetically modified organisms have transformed the global food industry. They can be found in every grocery store and fridge across multiple countries, yet most people can't even tell the difference between GM and non-GM foods, especially in Canada, where they're not labeled. But before we delve deeper into this topic, we need to know exactly what GM foods are and how they impact Canada as a country.
According to the World Health Organization, GMOs are organisms whose DNA has been altered in a non-natural way through the use of genetic engineering. In the case of plants, these modifications can be made to add insect tolerance, virus resistance, or herbicide tolerance.
There have been clear positives to this technology, allowing the food industry to not just generate more food or bigger and better food, but to also generate more income to benefit the economy. However, modifying genetics can be a dangerous game, and the Canadian government is well aware of their current secretive method of regulation, undisclosed to the public.
So where does Canada stand in all of this?
According to Vita Health, over 64 countries either ban or label GMOs, but Canada is not one of them. The Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, CBAN, discloses that Canada has gone to become one of the top 5 GM crop producing countries in the world, producing 2 of the 4 highest produced GM crops, corn and soy.
CBAN also states that, quote, the regularization of GM crops was designed to support the emergence of new technologies and the new biotechnology industry and is mandated to keep Canadians and our environment safe from harm. Having said that, the regularization does not include the labeling of genetically modified foods unless, quote, there is a health or safety issue with the food which might be mitigated through labeling, as confirmed by Health Canada.
On that note, Canadian farmers and consumers want to know more about what they are putting into their bodies. The Canadian government does not share detailed information about GMO implementation and regulations to answer the public's questions. This instills fears into the public as they have no idea of what their food is actually made of.
As a result, the Canadian society is left with an abundance of unanswered questions. Given that genetically modified foods have revolutionized the food industry, people believe the Canadian government should look into the regulatory procedure again. So in order to decipher to what extent they should regulate them, we will be exploring this issue through the historical and ethical, economic, social and political, and environmental and health lenses.
Of course, one cannot understand GMOs without looking at their history. The discovery of genes occurred in 1865 by Gregor Mendel. It was not until over 100 years later, in 1987, that scientists began to create herbicide-resistant plants, thus opening the possibility of increased output and lower production costs. So that by 1995, the Canadian government had approved the first genetically modified canola varieties in potatoes.
Ethically, this revolution was not met with positivity at all, with protests against genetically modified foods occurring in the late 90s in Europe and the United States. This led many to wonder what will happen in Canada.
Research shows that historically, the US regulates GMOs according to emotions and what the people fear, while Europe has a much more scientific way of analyzing the harmful effects of GMOs and regulating them accordingly. Political science professors at the University of Montreal revealed that Canada regulates their GMOs much more akin to the scientific way that Europe has.
But for Canada, this meant that the data assessed, as well as the way the regulatory officials determine the safety of GM crops, would exclude public consultation. This is why there is so much uncertainty with the government as to how GM foods affect society. So we had to turn to the research and findings of others to answer our questions.
Adding religion to this complicates matters. In a research article done by Robert and Michael Rucker states, the religious objections range from the view that human-made gene modifications are tantamount to arrogantly assuming godlike roles in the violation of given religious food laws. Nonetheless, Bjorn Miska, a professor of religious studies at the Norwegian University, reveals that it is our very essence of human nature to alter our environment.
But will this alteration of our environment be a benefit or a detriment to the economy? David Bullock and Elisabeth Nitze attempt to answer this question in their book, Genetically Modified Organisms in Agriculture, Economics and Politics. They unveil that theoretically the introduction of GM crops in the form of glyphosate-resistant soybean lowers production costs for farmers, and by lowering herbicide use, this in turn lowers the price for consumers.
In addition to this, Martin Quinn and Wilhelm Klumper, professor and students of food economics, disclosed that GM crops even reduced pesticide technology by 37% and increased farmers' profits by 68%.
On that note, there's evidence that GM foods may not necessarily be beneficial to Canada as a developed economy. The American Economic Association's 2014 Journal of Economic Perspectives states that developing countries are more likely to benefit from GM crops than already developed ones. Now, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada revealed that Canada's climate is expected to be warmer. But how does this tie into Canada's economy? Well, this means that the growing season can be extended. This, and I quote, could increase productivity and allow the use of new and potentially more profitable crops.
In terms of the economic effects and the actual implementation and regulation process, one cannot be the same. The implementation process is broken into 3 stages: discovery, developmentation, and authorization. Using data from CropLife, a 2011 Phillips McDougall study unveiled that all 3 stages cost $136 million on average.
Interestingly, the regulation procedure counts for 25.8% of that cost. As a matter of fact, even just labeling foods as GM-free increase production costs. Therefore, whether or not the crop is genetically modified, its implementation is costly to all.
With GMOs being such a radical alteration on human nutrition, the economic effects are as important as the social effects. The Canadian population is uneasy about GMOs, as the government keeps them in the dark. It is of no wonder that they would turn to anti-GMO websites, like GMOawareness.com, to listen to news of vegetables being rejected with fish genes.
Although this social lens compares with the ethical lens on the fact that GMOs affect the religious views of society, thereby creating conflicts due to these differing views, the social lens delves deeper into a conflict not recognized by the government. This is the conflict between small local farmers and agricultural businesses. Clearly, in today's world, the food industry is changing rapidly and drastically as multinationals are replacing the slow, traditional way of farmers that some have been using through generations.
Robert L.E. Brack de la Perrière, author of Brave New Seeds, The Threat of GM Crops to Farmers, explains that these multinationals were producing genetically modified foods in a quantity and at a rate that regular farmers couldn't match, due to their ever-growing wealth and technological advancement.
With any form of technological advancement, there will always be impacts on the environment, especially now that GM crops have become drastically more prevalent in today's society. It has also become an ongoing concern as to whether GMOs will affect human health through their ingestion and whether they will affect the environment through their cultivation.
Agricultural economist Graham Brooks and visionary farmer Peter Barfoot assessed the environmental impacts of GM crops in a 2015 study and discovered that there were multiple environmental benefits of GM crops. For example, they revealed a new technology has reduced pesticide spray by 581 million kilograms and has reduced environmental footprint associated with pesticide use by 20%.
Not only this, but the study even acknowledged that GM crops have significantly reduced the greenhouse gas emissions. We also found out that the adoption of biotech cotton positively affected the quantity and diversity of beneficial insects in countries like the US and Australia. Moreover, their use has helped in the expansion of conservation tillage and no-till cultivation systems. This all means that 1 billion tons of soil per year in the US have been saved. Now, with the US being a developed economy like Canada, we believe that Canada could potentially enjoy these benefits too.
While it would be easy to simply look at the benefits of GMOs, there are also some possible environmental risks. A major concern is the possibility of outcrossing to weedy relatives of plant species, or even creating a new species of weeds that is resistant to regular weed killers and might possibly invade other species' environments.
In regards to human health, a clear positive effect to the implementation of GMOs is the significant reduction of pesticide use and poisoning to farmers. Although consumers remain unsure about the effects on allergic reactions and other side effects. Megan L. Norris, cellular microbiology student at Harvard University, revealed in her article on the safety of GM foods that, without a doubt, there were no differences between the GMO eating and non-GMO eating animals to any organisms, even on a microscopic level.
This concurred with the findings of the American Medical Association, World Health Association, Health Canada, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the National Academy of Sciences.
From our research, it appears that those who claim that GM crops are detrimental to human health are simply small anti-GMO advocacy groups whose arguments are not based on scientific facts.
With all the data and sources we reviewed, we concluded that the main concern of GMOs is the concern of the consumers themselves and the lack of transparency. As stated earlier, most people don't know whether they're eating GMO or non-GMO crops.
From this, we considered that Canada should make labeling of GMO and non-GMO crops mandatory before the crop is approved for sale and distribution. Through the labeling, all foods will be easily recognizable as GMOs or non-GMOs.
Although they would not know what the regulation process of that crop entailed, at least they would not feel unsure about what they are eating. Now that would make for some sort of consumer consideration. Now it won't be a bed of roses. Yes, this does solve the social and ethical concerns, but the economic impact still proves difficult.
As we said earlier, according to the Journal of Economic Perspectives, the mere labeling of a product as GM-free increases production costs. Therefore, labeling becomes a cost for agricultural companies and farmers. This means that, economically speaking, this solution will be beneficial to Canada in the long run because the increased cost will mask the effect of the increased income generated by GM crops. In the end, the agricultural sector will be left with large and unnecessary costs.
After this, we considered what would happen if the consumers were just more educated on GM crops, because we do not have any tangible basis on which to criticize the regulation itself, as it's all conducted behind closed doors.
So, in order to solve the issue of social fear and uncertainty in consumers, the Canadian government should look into educating consumers about GMOs so that they know there are no scientific health concerns.
But we find this can only be successful if the government is more transparent with the regulatory process, as being more transparent will prevent consumers from thinking there's something crooked or shady about the regulation process. So how can we educate the public and raise awareness on GMO benefits?
Well, this can easily be done through the employment of social media platforms. For example, creating government-run chat rooms easily accessible to the public that discuss these issues. We believe that this would be effective, seeing as today's world is all about connection.
Another way could be through courses in school. For instance, in social science and science courses, the impacts of GMOs would be an engaging topic for students, as well as aid in raising a generation that truly understands GMOs.
Of course, our solution does not come without a few drawbacks. This will lead to increased costs for the government through the funding of these projects. However, this is a short-term cost, and its effects will eventually die down, unlike the long-term cost effects of labeling.
Also, no matter how much one can educate the population, fear is forever present. So there will always be people using all sorts of platforms, for example, social media, news reports, etc., to advocate against GMOs, as we have seen with the 1997 issue with vaccines causing autism.
We would also like to suggest for the Canadian government to simply publish the regulation procedure. This would further inform the public and greatly reduce their fears. Now, we do realize that there will be a limit as to what extent they will publish for the public to see, but the simple step of letting the public know would be greatly appreciated.
Ultimately, we believe this solution will still better the stance of consumers concerning GMOs, even though it will be faced with some resistance, because whether we like it or not, resistance accompanies all forms of revolutions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll start off. Question for Miriam. What's interesting, that you clearly had the science research in terms of the GMOs not being harmful. To the research you found that was most compelling that GMOs were negative?
Sorry, I didn't hear.
What is the most compelling evidence that you found against
GMOs? Well, the most compelling evidence, does it have to do with the health factor, or it could be about anything? So the most compelling thing I found about negative effects of GMOs was the effect they had on the small local farmers. Because small local farmers do not necessarily have the resources and the money to be able to do that, to be able to create that type of technology to put in their crops, they were eventually falling behind in comparison to the huge agricultural companies like Monsanto and all of them. So as a result, the small local farmers who still contribute a bit to the economy were losing their money, were losing their form of livelihood, and this usually small local farmers, that job that they do is usually something that they pass down generations, and that means that GMOs could potentially cut down this tradition of local farming. So that was the most compelling argument against GMOs that I found.
What was the specific evidence in terms of the sources that supported that?
According to Owen's research, he found this article that talked about, I can't remember the exact person that conducted the article, but he found this article that talked about the effects of GMOs on the small local farmers, and it was, according to his lens, it was his lens that actually opened my eyes to see that effect, because that could also impact the economy as well, and I hadn't really taken note of that in my research.
So Owen, what was your lens?
The social and political.
Okay, so how do you think your understanding of the overall topic was impacted by Trevor's lens and the research that Trevor did?
Well, my lens was, I was actually surprised when we started compiling our information because my lens was very against GMOs because of just how unknown it was to just society as a whole, and of course how Miriam stated about like the farmers losing their jobs and heritage and things like that. And so Trevor's was a lot more for GMOs, and so I started to get a different perspective on it, rather as the somewhat biased of, not as much bias as just not having enough information as people who belong to Trevor's lens might have.
Can you give like a specific example or one or two pieces of information from Trevor's lens that like specifically kind of just opened your eyes to a different look at the topic?
I think I can't name anything specifically, but
That's okay. Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, Mackenzie, in the future, what would you change, or would you change anything about group norms based on the presentation in your project?
I feel our group communicated very well and very consistently. Like, we immediately had a group chat, we immediately talked and figured out and went on. We used Google Classroom, not Google Classroom, we used Google Docs, so we could all see what we changed, and we got together. I wish we could have got together a bit more in person as a group. Like, we did meet up a couple times, but in those times really helped our presentation. But I feel like if we would have done it more, then we could have been just a bit more prepared. But I feel generally our group did pretty well preparing.
And Trevor, based on, when you look at your solutions and proposals, what was the strongest counter argument to the solutions that you proposed that wasn't about money?
Okay. Well, I'd say the feasibility, because there's only so many people that are going to look at Canadian government social media, or there's only so many people that would actually care what they say or even believe what they say, as they've been in the dark about it for so long. So you might not trust the information you're getting, or it might not impact you. So there's so many people that this wouldn't actually affect. There's some that it would have a great impact on, informing them about what's really going on in Canada as in regards to GMOs, but I feel like there's a wide margin of people that either they wouldn't care about it wouldn't affect their daily life, or they just aren't having access to that social media platform that the Canadian government would use.
How would you propose that they reach those people that aren't being reached?
Use as many platforms as they could. Really, like, use Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, everywhere they can. Make it a public statement. Try and make some sort of news, like show that they haven't been in the dark, like be open about that and say, this is what we're doing now, this is our restrictions, and this is how we're going to deal with it in the future, so that it gets widespread. Then it's on news platforms, CBC, all those sorts of things. Then that'll reach a lot more people that way.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.